And welcome back. And we're going to go through the paper that I did. I actually did this yesterday, so I thought I'd give it 24 hours. I've been thinking about one of the questions in particular. I think I've dropped a mark, but let's see when we get there. Again, I haven't checked the mark scheme, haven't had a look. We'll see how this does. Before I start that, however, I did 1, 2, and I've sort of copied some stuff over here. I did want to talk about a mark scheme. I think it's one of these things. Clearly, if your maths is brilliant, you're not going to have an issue getting above the certain barriers to get certain grades. But marks are lost for doing silly things, not realising how exam papers are marked. And I've been an exam marker, and I can tell you that quite often some things are unreadable, some things are hard to follow, and it's always the case that we try and mark carefully, but people do lose marks. So I'm not going to read all of this out, but this is the mark scheme guidance, and I've highlighted some bits already, and I just want to highlight some things that you may not be aware of. Well, let's look at the first one. So the first one says all candidates will receive the same treatment. Well, that sounds obvious. But what it's trying to say is mark schemes are marked, or the exam papers are marked fairly according to the mark scheme. There's no, well, I quite like this person, I know them, or I don't like them, or their writing's not very neat. So we have to be fair and clear what we do. And then there is always this, and I did this probably about 10 times, which if I'm not sure, especially with A-level marking, I then send it off to go and get reviewed elsewhere. Next point says something very similar. So mark scheme is marked positively. Examiners should be prepared to award 0 marks. Now this is quite important 2 sentences here. So we do look for the marks. We don't say, oh, I can't be bothered to look for it. We will try and find the marks. But also, if you've just done some maths, but it's all the wrong math, even if it's some brilliant maths, but it's about the wrong thing, 0 marks. The mark scheme is about building the steps to get you to the final mark. Let's run through the rest of these a bit more quickly. You can pause the video and have a read through on your own. It's on the website of Edexcel. Different exam boards are slightly different, but same sort of idea. Right, a key one. Where working is not required, you will get 4 marks. Where working is required, I need to see specific steps. And we'll talk about that as we go through this exam paper that I'm marking now. This is one you may not know. Crossed out work is marked unless it's replaced. And then choice of method. So basically, if you indicate what your final answer is, I will look at the method that gets you to that answer. And it's my job as an examiner to try and work out what you've done to get you to the thing that you want to present. So you'll quite often see me, a bit less so yesterday because I was sort of doing on an iPad and it wasn't a real exam, but I'll underline things or I'll write things on the, I'll be very clear about what is the answer that I am presenting. Incorrect method, again, steps the obvious, so especially with the harder questions. So there's a question, I think I got 4 to 1, I think it's a ratio question. If you've just done the wrong things, but it's fallen out accidentally, that's 0 marks, because you've got the right answer for the wrong reason. You have to show you've got there in the right way. ISW is quite important, so ignoring subsequent work, that's not always the case. If it tells you to do something and you do more than you're supposed to do, you might lose the marks because you haven't done what it says. But at the same time, you may also get away with it. Depends on the question. The point is, read the question. Probability, here's one that you may not be aware of. If you write your probability answer as a decimal, it must be 2 decimal places, unless there's only 1 decimal place needed, in which case that's fine. And then finally down the bottom, again, another one you may not be aware of is if you misread a question. So let's say it says here in the example, you read 252 instead of 255, you will get method marks because you've misread the question, but you've tried to do the right thing. You probably won't get the final mark. In fact, you almost indefinitely won't get the final mark, but you may well get the marks. And it says again, examiners should send any instance to review. So I will send that off and it will get reviewed. If we look at the mark scheme itself, we have to be very careful that these, Edexcel tends to give what it's looking for quite specifically. AQA will give an indication of the answer that you expect. It doesn't have to be exactly the same things, but they are very specific. So well, in many ways, this is the worst example because M1 for a start to a method is pretty vague. But what that means is I can see you're trying to do the right thing. So that could be multiplying by 10, or that could be doing some cancelling, or it could be doing some sort of long division, whatever it might be. And then A1 for getting the digits correct, and then another A1 as in an accuracy mark for getting the actual full answer correct with the decimal place in the right place. So for example, you do some work and you accidentally drop a 10, you write 68.2, you've got 2 out of 3, because you've kind of done the right thing, you just made a silly error along the way. Now the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to go through, I'm not going to jump back and forth to the mark scheme because that's, I think, can be a little bit tedious. So I'll put a link to the mark scheme in the description and then I'll read out where I've got the marks. And again, I'm going to try and be really honest and strict here. So I've got the mark scheme in front of me on paper. You might hear me sort of rustling and go back and forth a bit, but I'm sure that'll be okay. Right, let's go. I'm going to keep a track of how many marks I've lost because I'm kind of hoping that number's going to be 0, but again, we'll see. So work out 814. So method mark, first method mark is for anything sensible. I would consider any sort of division or rewording as being the sensible mark. I consider 682, so that's another mark. And then the final mark for 682 with the right decimal places, and that's given me 3 out of 5. So far, I've lost 0, which I'm happy with so far. Next one, question 2, the probability question. Now, easy to make a mess here. So there's 1 mark for the process of doing 1 minus, in other words, the sum, or 1 minus 0.7. So there's my method mark. 1 mark for complete process. So I'm, okay, that's a complete process here for doing the estimate. And then 1 mark for the correct answer, which is 75. I will say the way I've written this doesn't look great now, but it's clearly 75, which is what I'm trying to present. So I've got those marks. Onto this one. Now, the way it will work is it'll give you some examples. So again, I won't do this for everyone because it's a bit tedious, but I'll give you some examples of what it means. So it will say acceptable answers include, it makes an underestimate, the number will be higher, the accuracy will go up. So obvious things that basically said things go higher, which is what I've done. So I've got that mark. Not acceptable answers will be things like my answer will change because it's vague. My answer is incorrect, vague. The point of the question is it wants you to recognize that the fact the probability is greater has a definite direct effect in one direction. So specific directional answer. First question, or second question actually, so far hanging in there. Question 3. Now remember, correct answer 4 marks. So the correct answer is 2 1/3, which is correct. So I've got all the marks here. If you didn't get that, there's 1 mark for any sort of correct fractional step. So it could be improper fractions, or it could be doing the denominator. Now, next question says show that. So I have to have shown first mark for doing the improper fractions, which I've done. First mark, next mark then for knowing how to divide, keep, change, flip. And then the final mark is what's called a C1 mark, which is a complete work showing the full answer. In other words, I have to be comfortable that I've shown how to get from the start to the end very clearly, which I think I've done because I've shown all the steps, and that's given me the C1. So I still think I have dropped 0 marks. So far, so good. Question 4. Okay, and this is a give a reason, although it's got a correct answer. The correct answer is 180 minus 4e, but I did need to see a reason. Now the reasons could be, there's a few ways of doing this, but I'm going to read this out. You must have written either alternate angles are equal, allied or co-interior angles add to 180, or corresponding angles are equal. So I've written my description. I've written that first mark is for angle ACD equals E, ACD. Oh, okay. So it's saying either you recognise that that's E, or you've recognised that this is 3E, or you've used the idea of 180 minus, which is what I've done. So the correct method. So that's fine. Problem with these mark schemes, by the way, is people do it in different ways. So the mark schemes has to have lots of different variations that you can do, but I've got that right. Question 5, 1 mark. Where have I got to? There we go. Question 5. 1 mark for any rounding, so I've got that. 1 mark for doing distance over speed, which I've done. Then 1 mark for getting the correct answer following through their correct rounded distance and speed. So in other words, the correct answer is 10, which I've done on correct numbers, so that's okay. Part B, so you remember part B was basically about, is it an under or overestimate? I said overestimate, so the answer is overestimate, that's a mark. And then I must also have a correct reason. So e.g. overestimate is dividing a larger number by a smaller number. Well, that's kind of what I spoke about with numerator and denominator. So I'm happy with that. Overestimate is larger number, smaller number. Overestimate is miles rounded up and speed rounded down. Yeah, that's okay. That's fine. I've made it clear, I understand why it's gone up. Question 6. Now again, correct answer 4 marks, so it is 55, so I'm happy I've got the marks. 1 mark for finding the process of being total interior, 1 mark for basically doing what I do, which is labelling the angles, and 1 mark for the calculation, which is running through. Not too bad. So far I'm still on 0, I believe. Excellent. Right, this is the, now, I'm going to read this out because I think it's quite important. So, rate of change of volume, which is basically what I've written, good. Acceptable answers include rate of water being poured, speed of water leaving the tank. So basically understanding how quickly the water is leaving. Not acceptable answers is something describing correlation or amount of water decreasing, because that hasn't got the word rate in, so it's not about the amount. And just making a statement about it's going down. So you need to be specific to do the idea it's how much is moving per second or the rate of change. Okay, still so far so good. I'm going to write my 0 because I feel something's coming soon. Next question. Again, correct answer 4 marks. So it is 4.5, so I'm happy I've got 4 marks here. There was a mark for finding the area, which I've called 2D, so you can see it's within there. And there's a mark for the complete process, which I've done. So that's 4.5 meters for the answer. Keeping track so far. Right, this is where I might have made an error simply because the scale and being able to zoom in. Right, let's have a look. 9A, B3 for a fully correct box plot. Oh, that's not very helpful, is it? It's going to be in numbers. Yeah, it does. So the numbers are 8, 25, 34, 42, and 74. 8, 25, 34, 42, and 74. Again, this will be done on an overlay. So literally a piece of transparent paper, put on the top. Have I got it correct? I have. I'm just going to quickly check. So 74, 42, 34. Yeah, I've put all these lines in the right place. That's okay. All good. Excellent. And then we had this bit at the end, which is the same question. So the pass mark for the test was 40. Is she correct? So you must show how you get your answer. So she is correct, which is fine, but I need to have the reason. Now what it says here is basically the calculations I've done. So I need to see 60 minus 18 or 60 minus 42. You're allowed, oh, that's interesting. You have to have had 18. Normally it allows a bit of flex when you sort of do these questions, but it does say, oh no, you can have, if you've done it with 40 instead, you're allowed to do that as long as you've made a correct follow on. So you can see my working, I've got the answer, correct follow through there. Excellent. Okay, a bit less worried about these. So first one is 10, correct answer only. So 1 for doing the calculations, 1 for the correct answer. And then I've got 1/8, which is fine as well. And then this process steps along the way. You can do this in lots of different ways, but any sort of process which is correct to get there. Okay, so far so good. Question 11. Oh, right, okay, this is the one I'm worried about. Question 11, explanation. For explanation, acceptable answers, the sum must be 5 and the product must be 6. She had the sum and the product the wrong way round. It should be the other way round. A and B must be multiplied together to make 6. Not acceptable answers. The answer should be, well, as in you've answered a different question. The product of A and B is not 5. And I've written, Kate has a calculation for A and B back to front. I'm not sure about that. Does that mean, that kind of implies that the sum's correct and the product is not about the sum. I don't think I've got that right. I'm not going to give myself that. I'm going to be strict on that. I know what I was trying to say. I said it badly because I did exactly what I told everyone listening to this not to do, which I didn't really think about the question. The question says, what is wrong with Kate's statement? And what is wrong is she's done the product to get the 5 and she's done the sum to get 6, and they should be the other way around. I think I've worded that badly. I'm not going to give myself that mark. Right, 2B. That's fine. And this was a difficult one. That's all good as well. So I am now on -1. Boo. Okay, question 12. Right, 1 mark for using any multiplier. 1 mark for, God, it's really hard to read what it wants you to do here. 1 mark for then dividing it by 2. So in other words, you're understanding this bit here. And then 1 mark for the process to get this answer, and then the correct answer is correct. So again, I got the marks, I got the correct answer. The marks along the way are a bit harder to get. I think it's basically 1 mark for getting the first scale factor, 1 mark for linking them together, 1 mark for the process, and 1 mark for the correct answer. So I'm still on -1. Okay, I remember this one. I hated this question. I think looking back, it is, having thought about it for a second, I read this as -13 and -140 originally when I was trying to work out my factors. Of course, it's the case that -140 is -20 times 7. That would have been much quicker. Anyway, I got the correct answer. The correct answer is 7. Marks along the way, so 1 mark for setting it up, 1 mark for expanding, 1 mark for getting the full, i.e. to this bit here, and then 1 mark for the answer. Oh, sorry, 1 mark for here, and then 1 mark for getting to there, and then 1 mark for the correct answer. By the way, all of this was only a mark. So basically, you got all the marks for doing the bringing it together, which is how it tends to work, which is quite nice. So all my 729 stuff only got me a mark at the end. Still on -1. Sign rule question. This is where it all cancelled down. The correct answer is 6. 1 mark for using the sign rule, and 1 mark for recognising either of these two exact values. So basically, I've got 1 mark for getting either of these, and 1 mark for sign rule. 3 marks overall. Still on -1. Oh, cold. Right, the parallelogram question. The answer is 4 to 1. However, you must show all your working. Now, these are really complicated. The mark scheme for this is long because people do it different ways. So very roughly, there's going to be 1 mark for working out 1 mark for working out y to z or o to x. Always an easy mark to start. So always do something with these questions, even if you don't know what to do. Then 1 mark for doing x to n, and 1 mark for doing the other one. By doing, you have to have got the correct thing as well. So doing and getting the correct outcome. And then 1 mark for the comparison, which is 4 to 1. So it wasn't the hardest question, but marks along the way. Still on -1. Rationalise. Wasn't worried about these. Multiply by √5, so 1 mark for the process, 1 mark for the answer. The answer is 3√5. Or you're allowed to write down √45. That was acceptable as well. And this one, I was a bit worried about this when I was doing the maths, but it kind of fell out okay. So 32 minus 9√3/11. Good. It's all correct. Now, there's 1 mark for the method, in other words, multiplying top and bottom by 1 minus 2√3. 1 mark for doing some correct expanding, and 1 mark for the correct answer at the end. Okay, still on -1. Right, this is where I thought I may not have shown enough. So the answer is 100. So I've got the 1, 2, I've got the 3 marks for the working, and then I just need to give 1 correct, appropriate in the right place. Circle theorem. So I did write alternate segment theorem. You could have also done angle at centre is twice angle at circumference, or the tangent is perpendicular to the radius. Didn't write that one actually, but anyway, you didn't need it, did you? So that seems strange. All right, next one, still on -1. This was straightforward. 4x plus 3/5, correct, 2 marks. 1 mark for having a method, the y equals method, or the flowchart method, and then 1 mark for the correct answer. 1 mark here for substituting the correct way round, 1 mark for getting g of -9, and 1 mark for the correct answer, which is 100. Still on -1. Right, this one I could have got wrong. Let's have a look. 0.204, excellent. Now, it doesn't say show working, so I would have got all the marks. However, the marks were for 1 mark for finding any correct product, so either A beating B and then A beating D. 1 mark for finding both products, 1 mark for complete process being correct, and then 1 mark for the correct answer. So most people, I suspect, would have got a mark at least for doing some probability, but it was realising that you had to do 3 together. That's basically, if you did 2 numbers multiplied by each other, you got a mark, and then the third number was for the second and third mark was for recognising that you combine probabilities. Okay. Last question. This will be a much quicker video because I'm just going through what I've done. So this was a show that, and you must show all your workings. I'm going to be really strict on this. So 1 mark for the process of finding P. Well, I've shown that quite clearly, which is √3. You didn't have to get √3, just need the process. 1 mark for the process to find the gradient of the tangent, which I've done. You just had to write 1 over √3. Okay, that's fine. Okay, I wondered whether you had to write rise over run or anything, but you don't. 1 mark for substituting in, so in other words, this bit here, and then 1 mark for rearranging, which gives me this here, which of course is the answer because it didn't give you the answer, does it? So the 3 and the 4. Good, excellent. So basically, scored all the way to the top. Didn't go terribly, did it? Out of 80, -1, so I've got 79 over 80. Obviously I would, this is not a thing about me showing how great I am. I'm a maths teacher. You would expect me to do quite well. Equally, there is a couple of points here, right? If I did a maths GCSE or A level, I'd probably drop 1 mark somewhere. I shouldn't do. I should get it all right. But you are going to drop silly marks here and there. So you need to make sure you're on top of all the topics to pick up as many marks as you can. The other thing to note, and I didn't check my time, I think it was about 40 odd minutes, wasn't it? Is I did this with loads of time left. If you understand what you're doing, if you have practiced all the topics, and if you then go away and practice the topics you couldn't do, you can finish these papers relatively quickly. That applies less at A-level. A-level, you don't have as much free time, and further maths even less so, but you should be okay time-wise. It is about just making sure you watch my 5 a day, or you do your practice, whatever it is, and you should be fine. Anyway, hope you enjoyed the video. As ever, please like, subscribe. You think I've been unfair, you think I've over marked myself, let me know, and we'll have an argument in the comments, and I will speak to you all soon. Thanks all, bye.